A snowstorm traps Loch Dhu in silence, and Hamish Macbeth knows the danger is already inside the village. Where in the world are you listening from tonight? And if you enjoy these Highland mysteries, subscribe and make this part of your nightly ritual. Only 11% are subscribed, while 89% aren't. Your support truly means a lot. Hamish Macbeth had not meant to start the day in a bad temper, but the sky over Loch Dhu already looked worn out and sulky, and that was usually a sign. He stood at his station window with a mug of weak tea and watched the cold light creeping across the village like someone arriving too early to a party. The phone began to ring before he could finish drinking. Patel sounded cheerful in the forced way people used when they wanted to deliver trouble without taking responsibility for it. The tourists were coming, a whole coach of them. A Snowstorm at Tommel Castle package arranged by Priscilla's parents, who never seemed to understand that the Highlands were not an amusement park. Hamish muttered that it would blow over. It usually did. But the grumble in his voice made Lugs lift his head from the hearthrug. The dog stared at him with the sort of sympathy Hamish did not want. He put on his old jacket and trudged out into the morning. The cold air hit him hard, and there was already the taste of snow in it. At Patel's shop, the gossip had beaten him there. Mrs. McLean said she had warned the castle people months ago that winter schemes tempted fate. Patel said nothing, which was worse because it meant he agreed. A crofter buying paraffin whispered that English tourists always panicked at the first sign of weather, and another whispered back that city Scots were even worse. Hamish told them all to stop predicting doom, but his voice sounded half-hearted, even to himself. Someone asked if Priscilla would be meeting the coach herself. That raised a little smirk or two. People liked to pretend they found her elegant manner faintly amusing. Hamish left before anyone could comment on his expression. The call about the stuck coach came a moment later. Of course it did. He reached the main road to find the great lumbering thing planted halfway across the verge, its wheels spinning uselessly while a collection of overdressed people stood outside, shivering as if personally insulted by Scotland. Colin Fraser, the tour organiser, was shouting before Hamish even stepped out of the Land Rover. Colin was a broad man with a red face and the smug look of someone accustomed to getting refunds by sheer volume. He bellowed about backward roads and pointless villages while the nervous young couple tried not to meet anyone's eyes. A minister with a damp hat looked as though he was praying only for a return to Glasgow. The insurance man, for that was how he introduced himself as if it were a title, smirked at everything. Alison Drake, the quiet travel writer, stood slightly apart, taking notes in a small book. She was elegant in the stiff way southern women often were, with the sort of coat that never seemed to pick up mud. She watched Hamish with cool interest, which made him feel scruffier than usual. He ignored her and went to look at the coach. He asked Colin, politely enough, to turn off the engine. Colin sneered, but did it. Hamish told the tourist to stand back. He kicked away some of the ice with the heel of his boot and guided the driver through a slow easing of the wheels. It was messy, noisy work, and Colin complained throughout. When the vehicle finally lurched free, Hamish felt as if he had personally lifted it with his bare hands. The coach crawled up toward the castle. Colin strode ahead to the payphone outside the reception, jabbing coins into it like weapons. His voice carried far across the courtyard. "You'll not cheat me again," he shouted. "I'll have every penny from you this time." A young maid hurried past Hamish, obviously pretending not to hear. The hotel manager stood stiffly behind the desk, face tight with embarrassment. Gossip would be flying before the hour was out. Lugs flattened his ears. Hamish felt the same. He caught a glimpse of Alison writing again, but she looked away when he met her eyes. The retired colonel, pipe clenched in teeth, muttered that in his day men did not screech like fishwives. The minister coughed politely, which in his case meant disapproval of everyone. Priscilla appeared then, crisp as frost, and thanked Hamish for helping. She looked tired around the eyes, though she would never admit it. She asked him to stay for the evening, voice perfectly calm, though he sensed the tension behind it. He made the mistake of saying he had paperwork waiting in Loch Dhu. She nodded in that way of hers that made him feel shabby, as if admitting he would not be of much use anyway. On the drive back to the village, the first heavy flakes began dropping, slow and sure. Hamish switched on the wipers, which smeared instead of clearing. The coach crawled behind him, its headlights glaring accusingly into his mirror. Lugs paced once on the back seat and then settled with a sigh. Lochdu looked smaller than usual under the falling snow. A few villagers stood outside Patel's shop, craning to see the coach lights through the white curtain. One of them asked Hamish if the tourists had already started fighting. Another wondered if the castle would refund bookings if the weather became too bad. No one liked to say outright that Priscilla's parents might be out of their depth, but the comment hung there anyway. Hamish only said it would be fine. He had said that too many times in his life. Inside, Patel gave him a cup of tea that tasted of resignation. A woman buying bread asked what he planned to do if the roads closed. He answered that he hoped they wouldn't. She snorted. Hope, in Lochdu, was usually a sign you had no plan. Back at the station, Hamish tried to busy himself with forms he would never finish. The heating rattled uselessly. Lugg stretched by the stove, watching him with those mild eyes that sometimes made him feel judged. Outside, the snow fell in large, wet clumps that stuck to the window and slid slowly down, making the world look blurred and uncertain. Hamish thought briefly about Priscilla, which annoyed him, so he turned back to his paperwork. A gust of wind rattled the loose gutter outside. He wondered, just for a moment, if he ought to have stayed at the castle. But then he told himself not to be dramatic. It was only a group of tourists. They would complain, they would eat, they would complain again, and the weather would pass. Still, the unease in his chest sat there like a stubborn stone. Luggs thumped his tail once, sensing something off but not knowing what. Hamish rubbed his eyes and wished for stronger tea. The phone did not ring again, which was somehow worse. The snow kept coming. By late afternoon, Lochdu looked cut off from the world. The street lamps flickered. A crofter trudged past the station window, pulling his collar up, and glanced at Hamish with the faint accusation of someone who believed the police should control the weather. Hamish turned away. He poked at the fire and made it no better. The silence grew. He felt as though the whole village were waiting for him to do something he hadn't quite realized he needed to do. When night began creeping in, the wind carried a faint rumor of more trouble. Later, after chains were fitted and the driver tried his luck again, the coach set off once more toward the castle. The coach's engine growled distantly as it tried to climb the last stretch to the castle. Hamish stood there listening to it, a knot tightening in his stomach. A full hotel of quarrelsome strangers. Snow deepening by the hour. A village ready to mutter that he should have stopped it. He looked down at Luggs, who had lifted his head again and was staring at him with worried ears. "Aye," Hamish said. "I ken." But the truth was he didn't. Not yet. By the next morning, the cold had worsened. It had crept into the station overnight, mean and stubborn, no matter how much Hamish poked at the fire. A nasty, mean cold that made the fire useless no matter how much Hamish poked at it. Luggs lay close to the stove, but kept glancing at the door as if expecting Trouble to walk in. Trouble, as usual, chose the telephone. It rang in short, irritated bursts. Hamish picked it up, already annoyed. Tommel Castle was on the line. The pipes were threatening to freeze. A few guests needed to be brought down to Lochdu before the heating gave out. No one asked if this was convenient. The manager simply said it, pausing only long enough to make Hamish feel responsible for the entire building. He told them to send the people down if they must, then hung up and muttered something rude. Luggs wagged his tail once, not understanding, just worried. The snow outside had stopped being pleasant hours ago. It piled itself into ridges against the buildings, and the main road had vanished under a smooth white carpet that made every car look abandoned. Hamish trudged out to meet the first group being escorted down from the castle. The tourists looked miserable, stamping their feet as if the ground were personally spiteful. The two who ended up in Patel's back room were pink-nosed and hopeless. Patel behaved as if he were running an emergency shelter, making a fuss over blankets but not letting anyone forget this was a shop, not a hotel. A local crofter got the retired colonel. The crofter did not want him. He tried to say he had sheep in the kitchen and couldn't possibly take another creature, but the excuse was thin. Hamish looked at him until he muttered something sullen and waved the colonel inside. The colonel puffed out his chest as though he were doing the crofter a favour, which did not help. By evening, most people had gathered in the Kirk Hall. Someone had made soup, and someone else had made tea, though both tasted like punishment. The village women sat stiffly with their visitors, trying to be polite and failing. The minister tried to begin a prayer, but no one wanted piety when the heating rattled like it was dying. The insurance man cleared his throat loudly and announced that if anything happened, everyone was fully covered. He said it with a smug smile that would have started a riot if the room were warmer. A woman near Hamish muttered that she'd like to cover him in something, and not politely. Hamish did not disagree. Colin arrived late and half drunk. He looked around the hall as though judging the worth of everyone in it. When offered a bowl of soup, he sneered that proper guests would expect something better. He made a comment about village cooking that sounded too loud in the cold hall. Mrs. McLean, who had made the soup, slammed her spoon on the table. She stood up, lips tight, and walked out. No one stopped her. Within a minute, people were speaking about it in little voices, each story worse than the last. Someone said Colin had insulted all Highland women. Another said he had refused to eat anything cooked by locals. Colin, hearing the whispers, rolled his eyes with drunken bravado. Hamish tried to calm things, but even the tourists stared at Colin as if he were contagious. The minister attempted another prayer and gave up halfway when he saw no one listening. Lugs wandered under the tables, tail low. Every time someone raised their voice, his ears twitched and he gave Hamish a mournful look. Priscilla arrived then. She looked pale and crisp as though the cold had been following her indoors. Her voice was steady when she spoke to her parents, but the tightness around her eyes told another story. Someone nearby whispered that the castle would be ruined if the tourists demanded refunds. Someone else whispered that lawsuits could follow. Hamish wished they would whisper more quietly. Gossip always sounded worse when the walls were cold. Priscilla walked toward him. Her greeting was polite and stiff, as if she were rehearsing for a role she disliked. Hamish stood too quickly, hitting his knee on the table. She pretended not to notice. She said she was managing, though he doubted that. The glance she gave him was cool, the sort of look that made him feel like a schoolboy with mud on his socks. He asked if the castle still had heating. She said it had something like heating. Then she excused herself to speak with the minister, leaving him feeling shabby and unhelpful. The wind outside thickened with snow until the windows were grey squares. Someone said the plough from Strathbane would come in the morning. Someone else said that meant next week. No one laughed. The roads were gone. The phone lines flickered like dying insects. Even the tourists stopped complaining for a while and sat hunched over their bowls, listening to the storm press against the walls. A young couple tried to telephone home from the Kirk office, but the line crackled and died. The wife began to cry softly. Her husband told her it was all right, then looked at Hamish as if expecting him to fix the weather. Hamish, feeling useless, said the plough really would come. He said it twice, though he did not believe it either. A few villagers slipped away early, giving him sideways looks that suggested this whole arrangement was somehow his fault. One crofter told Hamish that the castle should have shut its doors for winter, and that any trouble would land on the village. Hamish said nothing. There was no point arguing with someone who had already decided the blame. Colin wandered to the front of the hall and asked loudly why the police were not doing more to clear the roads. Hamish told him the police were not snow shovels. Colin smirked and said in Glasgow they would manage better. Hamish, irritated, muttered that he was welcome to return to Glasgow then. A few people snorted with quiet satisfaction. Colin did not hear them. In the corner, Alison Drake wrote something in her notebook, her expression unreadable. A villager leaned toward Hamish and said she was probably writing about how primitive Lochdu was. Hamish shrugged. Primitive or not, it was home. As the night dragged on, the hall grew colder. People shifted closer to one another without admitting they were doing it. The minister tried to organize blankets, but half the village pretended not to hear him. Pride made people foolish when the weather turned bad. Hamish walked the room slowly, Lugs following like a shadow. He noticed the tourists watching the locals, and the locals watching back, each group certain the other was causing all the trouble. Near closing time, Colin stormed to the Kirk door and tried to yank it open. Snow pushed back. He swore loudly. Alison told him to sit down before he worked himself into a stroke. Colin muttered something offensive about women writers. Priscilla reappeared then, looking tired but composed, and she whispered to the minister to lock the door properly. Hamish stood by the hall window and saw nothing but white. The world had vanished. Lochdu was cut off, the castle was cut off, and everyone in them was stuck with one another whether they liked it or not. And with the tourists muttering and the villagers bristling, he felt a knot grow in his stomach. Something would go wrong. It always did when people were trapped together. Lugs pressed against his leg, uneasy. Hamish touched the dog's head and stared into the storm a moment longer, thinking only, a bad night, and the worst still coming. The morning was already wrong. The cold had a sharp, mean bite to it, and the snow outside Tommel Castle looked as if it had settled in for a long stay. Hamish arrived late, snow clinging to his trousers, lugs trotting behind him with the air of a dog who suspected he had been brought somewhere foolish. A maid at the door gave Hamish a nervous nod and whispered that everyone was a wee bit touchy. He told her they always were. Inside the ballroom, Priscilla's parents were attempting what they called a Highland morning. It looked more like a village jumble sale pretending to dance. A crackling stereo spat out a reel that made people sway uncomfortably rather than dance. The guests clapped in the wrong places. Colin prowled round the edges of the room, his face sour, complaining that the window was letting in half the blasted Arctic. He slapped the stiff sash with the palm of his hand, as though the window had personally offended him. Alison Drake stood neat and composed near the fire, scribbling in her notebook. She did not look entertained. A few villagers hired to help with tea avoided Colin, which Hamish thought sensible. One crofter muttered to Hamish as he passed, saying the man had been rude about the tea. Hamish said he was rude about everything. The reel was halfway through when the stereo gave a cough and died. A long groan went through the room. A handyman hurried to the fuse box, mumbling that old wiring did what it liked. Colin said loudly that proper hotels did not fall apart. Priscilla's mother pretended she hadn't heard. People drifted toward the windows and the fire. Hamish brushed snow from his sleeves. Lugs nosed at a patch of floor, then moved away as though the place offended him too. Hamish wondered if the dog had more sense than the whole room. Then there came a sharp cry. It came from the curtained alcove beside the draughty window. The guests turned as a cluster formed there, unsure whether to be curious or afraid. Hamish pushed through, heart sinking in that grim, familiar way. Colin lay sprawled on the polished floor, his head at an awkward angle, eyes half-lidded. His whiskey glass lay broken, the amber liquid running toward a groove in the wood. A woman beside him clapped her hand to her mouth, though Hamish suspected the gesture was more for show. Hamish knelt and felt the cold in his knees. A guest doctor, a thin man who seemed proud of his thinness, bent down too and muttered something about a possible cardiac event. "Happens at his age," the doctor said, though Colin was not particularly old. People murmured in agreement, relieved at the idea of death arriving neatly without scandal. But Hamish saw things that pricked at him. A bruise forming along Colin's jaw, a smear on the edge of the window frame, pale against the varnish, as if someone had grabbed it hard on the way down. Hamish touched the smear with the tip of his finger. It felt tacky as if freshly rubbed. Lugs backed away with a soft whine, not frightened but uneasy. The dog did not like the silence in the room. Neither did Hamish. Priscilla pushed through the crowd. Her face was white in the cold light. She looked at Colin without speaking, then looked at Hamish as though expecting him to fix something that was already broken. Her father demanded that Hamish telephone Strathbane at once. The tone suggested that if Hamish had arrived earlier, he might have prevented death itself. The line crackled badly when Hamish rang. Blair answered as if awakened from a foul dream. When Hamish said someone had died, Blair snapped that Hamish was not to go playing Sherlock again. He was to treat it as an accident until Blair arrived, as if Hamish had asked to solve anything. Hamish held the receiver away while Blair barked orders. When Blair finally hung up, Hamish felt no wiser, only annoyed. A maid hovered nearby, trembling. She said someone should check Colin's room. The idea had the nervous eagerness of gossip behind it. Hamish nodded, and she scurried off to fetch a key. Priscilla gave him a tight look, one that said she wished this were happening to someone else's hotel. In Colin's room, Hamish found the usual mess of a man who lived out of suitcases, clothes strewn, papers scattered. But one thing stood out, a gap on the desk where a small notebook should have been. Hamish knew it should have been there because there was a clear rectangular dust mark, the only patch of desk not dulled by fingerprints. He asked the maid if Colin had carried a notebook. "Oh, aye," she said, "wrote in it all the time, names and numbers and things." "Where is it now?" She blinked stupidly, which people often did when asked something simple. She said she did not know. Maybe he had put it in a pocket. Maybe someone borrowed it. Maybe it was lost. Her voice became quieter with each guess, as if shrinking from responsibility. Hamish did not press her. People lied more when pressed. Back in the ballroom, the guests were restless, shifting like sheep in a pen. The minister stood apart, wringing his hands, offering prayers no one wanted. The doctor repeated his opinion about heart trouble to anyone who would listen. It was neat, it was convenient, and it absolved everyone. Hamish almost envied him his certainty. Hamish knelt once more by the body. A bit of glass crunched under his knee. The whiskey smell was sharp. He touched the bruise again. People did not usually fall in ways that gave such marks unless someone helped them along, but he knew saying so would only start panic. "Is it murder?" someone whispered behind him. "No," Hamish said too quickly. It was the wrong answer, a reflex to keep the room calm, a mistake he felt even as he said it. Priscilla looked at him strangely, as if she sensed the lie. She said nothing. She rarely needed to. The handyman returned, saying the wiring was fixed, though his smugness did not match the situation. Hamish wondered if the man had been by the window before the fall. He asked quietly. The handyman looked offended and said he'd been nowhere near it. He said it too quickly. A red herring maybe, Hamish thought, or just a man who did not like being accused of anything. A few tourists gathered near Alison, who still stood by the fire. Someone asked her if she had seen anything. She replied calmly, "Only the usual chaos." She closed her notebook before Hamish could glance at it. He realized he did not trust her coolness, though he could not have said why. Hamish rose and told everyone to step back, though they already had. People always retreat from a body, even when they pretend to be helpful. The ballroom felt colder. Someone shut off the stereo as if music itself were disrespectful. The castle manager appeared again, wringing his hands even more than the minister. He whispered about liability and insurance. Hamish told him to calm down, though he had no business advising calm when he felt none himself. The window remained slightly open, just enough for a thin draught to slip through. Hamish pushed it shut, but it stuck halfway. The barman had already told him the side service door was latched all night. Hamish had even written it down. Someone behind him said they had told the staff weeks ago to fix that window. Someone else whispered that Colin had complained about it only moments before. Gossip grew legs in seconds. He looked once more at the smear on the frame. If the doctor was right, it meant nothing. If Hamish was right, it meant everything. He was not sure which thought annoyed him more. He gave his statement to Priscilla's father, who treated every word with suspicion. Hamish thought the man would blame him for the snow if he could. The guests clustered together, whispering in little groups that disintegrated whenever he walked past. Outside, the wind shoved at the castle walls like a rude neighbour. Lugs pressed against Hamish's leg, not frightened, only unsettled. Hamish stood in the doorway of the ballroom a long moment, watching the uneasy crowd, the body still on the floor, the window refusing to close properly. Something was wrong. Something had gone very wrong, but he did not yet know what. The trouble had already started before Hamish even reached Patel's shop. Lochdu looked half buried in snow, and the storm, though quieter, had left the roads blocked like stubborn cattle. But the village could always find a way to move trouble even when cars could not. News of Colin's death had blown through Lochdu faster than the wind, and by the time Hamish opened Patel's door, the air inside was thick with heat, peat smoke, and gossip. Patel gave him a stiff nod, the sort that meant he disapproved of something, but had not yet decided what. The peat stove sputtered in the corner. Around it sat a knot of villagers with faces tight from long speculation. Mrs. McLean announced, before Hamish even stepped fully inside, that Colin had fallen like a sack. Another woman corrected her sharply, saying he had been pushed like one because she had heard raised voices near the ballroom door. Hamish knew well enough that hearing could travel strangely in these old buildings, but no one wanted modest truths when a better tale could be made. He tried to push through to the counter, but they closed around him like hens fussing around spilled grain. Someone claimed to know that Colin had insulted the hotel staff all morning. Someone else said he had been arguing with the handyman, Ian McLean. The tone implied this alone made Ian half guilty. Patel busied himself wiping a spotless jar, pretending not to hear, which meant he had heard everything. Hamish cleared his throat and said, "People should hold their tongues till Blair arrived." He said it without conviction, which was a mistake. His failure to defend Ian firmly let the room brighten with renewed certainty. They took his hesitation as agreement. Mrs. McLean folded her arms triumphantly. "Aye, well, the man's temper's no secret," she declared. Hamish bit back a sharp reply. Lugs lay under the counter, ears twitching at every raised voice. He kept glancing up at Hamish as if expecting him to take charge. Hamish wished he felt capable of it. A crofter in a heavy coat said He himself had seen Ian slipping out of a side entrance at the castle just before the screams. Hamish knew how times and places blurred in the telling, but the crofter spoke with that smug certainty Highland men adopted whenever they wanted to win an argument. Patel nodded along, which was worse. Hamish muttered something about people seeing shapes that were not there when snow blew sideways. Few listened. They had the taste of scandal now, and no one wanted to spit it out. The door creaked open. Ian stepped inside, shaking snow from his boots, unaware of the sudden hush. He walked to the counter to buy tobacco, nodding politely, but the silence around him thickened like freezing fog. People looked away, though not far enough to miss anything. Hamish cursed inwardly. Ian noticed the shift. He turned to Hamish with a strained, uncertain look. "You don't think I did it, do you?" he asked. His voice wavered between defiance and worry. Hamish meant to reassure him, but the room felt like a trap. He said only, "Let's not jump to conclusions." It was a cowardly half-answer, and he knew it the moment he said it. Ian's face closed, hurt settling there plain as bruising. He paid Patel, who took the coins too carefully, and walked out into the snow without another word. The silence he left behind was louder than the gossip had been. Villagers shifted with the malicious satisfaction of people whose suspicions had just been fed, not starved. Patel leaned over the counter. "Folk say he hated the man," he murmured. "Should have seen his face when Colin mocked his work." Hamish set his jaw. "A lot of folk hated him," he said. "Doesn't it make them murderers?" Mrs. McLean sniffed. "Maybe not, but some folk take offence harder than others." She looked toward the door with a pointed expression. Trying to redirect the conversation, Hamish asked if anyone had seen Colin after he left the ballroom the previous night. Patel brightened with the eager look of someone who had stored a tidbit specially for this moment. "He was outside by the payphone," he said, slipped an envelope into his coat pocket after the shouting, looked pleased with himself. Hamish frowned. "What sort of envelope?" "White," Patel said, unhelpfully. "The usual sort." "Did he still have it this morning?" "Not that I saw," he shrugged. "Folk say these things go missing when trouble starts." Whether Patel meant stolen or hidden, Hamish could not tell. Or perhaps Patel enjoyed the ambiguity too much to clarify. Another woman chimed in suddenly, eager not to be left behind. She said Alison, the travel writer, had complained that the draughty ballroom window had been at it again, whatever that meant. "Said someone must have fiddled with it," the woman added. "Maybe that has something to do with it." Hamish felt an uncomfortable tug of curiosity. Alison had seemed cool and observant, but tourists always acted odd when trapped in the Highlands. He filed the comment away, unsure whether it was a clue or a waste of thought. The talk swirled again, louder now, mixing truth with nonsense. Someone proclaimed that Colin had owed money all over Scotland. Someone else said Colin had meant to sue the castle. A fisher insisted he had overheard Colin the last night on the phone promising revenge. The confidence in their voices rose with every word, though none of them had been at the ballroom doorway, and none could have heard over the howling weather. Hamish finally pushed free of them, bought a packet of tea he did not need, and stepped outside. The cold felt cleaner than the air inside. Lugs padded after him, shaking himself as though ridding his fur of the villagers' suspicion. Hamish rubbed the dog's head once, briefly. He trudged back toward the station, boots crunching on packed snow. He kept seeing Ian's face when he asked that question. It settled in Hamish's mind like a small stone, annoying and immovable. He had not defended the man properly. That failure would cost him, he was sure. Lochdu never forgave a misstep in loyalty, even if the village itself had none to spare. When he reached the station, the fire had sunk low. The room smelled of damp wool and old forms. Hamish fed the fire half-heartedly and stared at the flames. Lugs curled by the hearth with a soft huff. Outside, the wind combed through the snowdrifts, reshaping them without mercy. Hamish felt the weight of the day pressing in on him, heavier than the storm. He had let the villagers get ahead of him, and once gossip took the lead, it never slowed. Ian was already marked, and Hamish, by saying too little, had helped hammer the mark deeper. He sat down, tugging his jacket tighter. He closed his eyes for a brief moment, hearing the villagers' voices echoing, each adding a new piece of trouble. Something was wrong. He was already mishandling it, and the case had barely begun. The first wrong thing was the noise. A deep, grinding roar shook the village long before Blair's convoy reached Lochdu. Hamish stood outside the station, lugs pressed anxiously against his leg, listening to the growl of engines fighting their way through the drifts. Snowplow first, then 2 police cars, then another that looked as though it had been dragged unwillingly behind the plow. Blair had arrived, and he wanted everyone to know it. Blair threw open the door of the lead car and stepped into the snow as if planning to arrest the weather. "Bloody place," he shouted before his boots even hit the ground. "Macbeth, where are you hiding?" Hamish did not bother answering. Blair spotted him anyway and lumbered forward, face already red with manufactured fury. "This is the last time," Blair said. "The very last time I get dragged into your incompetence. A man dies, and you turn it into a circus." Hamish said quietly, "You were the one who insisted on treating it as an accident." Blair ignored that. He stomped toward Tommel Castle, barking at Anderson to take notes if you can manage to write. The snowplow idled outside, rumbling like a sulky beast. Villagers watched from their doorways with the sour pleasure of people who disliked Blair but enjoyed seeing Hamish scolded. Inside the castle lounge, Blair set up a crude command post by sweeping half the coffee table onto the carpet. The guests sat in uncomfortable silence, clutching mugs of lukewarm coffee. Priscilla stood behind a chair, cool and expressionless. Blair pointed at the guest doctor. "You, tell me again why you think this was suspicious." The doctor hesitated. Earlier he had happily proclaimed a cardiac event, but Blair's glare made him wobble. "Well," he said, I suppose one cannot entirely rule out external." "Exactly," Blair crowed. "Murder. Clear as day." Hamish felt tired already. "You bullied him into that." Blair swung round at him. "Macbeth, you'll keep your mouth shut unless I ask you to open it." The guests shifted. A few looked almost amused. Hamish felt heat creep up his neck. Blair then demanded Ian McLean be brought in. Anderson fetched him from the corridor, where he had been waiting with the slump of a man expecting bad luck. Ian hardly had time to remove his cap before Blair pounced. "Ye argued with the dead man. You were seen skulking about the side entrance. You've got a temper, haven't ye?" Blair barked. Ian blinked rapidly. I don't temper. I was fixing." "Fixing what?" Blair snapped. "The heating? Looks like you made a mess of that as well." The villagers watching recoiled at the humiliation, but none spoke. Ian stammered something about pipes. Blair cut him off. "See the guilt? Clear as sin," he declared loudly. The doctor nodded as if frightened not to. Hamish stepped forward. "There's more to consider. The missing notebook." "What notebook?" Blair barked. "The one Colin kept. It's not in his room." Blair rolled his eyes. "Macbeth, if you lost your marbles, do it on your own time. A man like that probably forgot where he put it." Hamish tried again. "And the envelope he put in his coat. Patel saw it." "You stick to your wee sheep," Blair sneered, "and let real police work alone." A few guests tittered nervously. Priscilla's gaze slid toward Hamish, cool and unreadable. That made it worse. Ian, pale and sweating now, whispered, "Hamish, tell him I didn't touch the man." Hamish opened his mouth, but Blair thundered, "Shut it, the both of you!" Hamish shut it. His silence landed like a stone in the room. Ian's shoulders sagged. Villagers in the doorway exchanged uneasy looks. Hamish knew he had hesitated too long and too publicly. Blair, delighted with himself, clapped his hands. "Right, we'll hold him for now." He signalled Anderson, who grabbed Ian by the elbow. Ian did not resist, but he turned one last wounded look at Hamish, a look that said more than any accusation. Lugs gave a low whine, picking up the tension. As Anderson led Ian out, Alison Drake stepped forward slightly. She had been observing the whole scene as if taking mental notes for a long, cold article. "Inspector," she said in her level voice, "you might like to know there was a wax smear under the window, as if a candle had been placed there. I made a note of it earlier." Blair did not even turn her way. "A candle? What is this, a fairy story?" he said. "Ignore that." He waved at Hamish as if swatting a fly. "And you, stop trying to confuse things. You're out of your depth." Hamish felt the sting. There's no confusion in looking properly at a scene. "Oh, I? And how would you know?" Blair laughed. "You didn't even get here on time yesterday." Priscilla spoke then, still polite. "Hamish, are you quite sure Ian is innocent?" Her tone carried no accusation, only distance. That made the question cut deeper. Hamish swallowed. "I didn't think it fits, that's all." "That is not reassurance," she said, and turned away. Blair puffed out his chest. "See? Even sensible folk can see what's in front of them." He jabbed a finger toward the corridor. "And what's in front of us is a killer who thought he was clever." Hamish almost said that Colin had been hated by half the hotel, that money had been shouted about on the phone, that the missing notebook mattered. But Blair's thick glare warned him that any contradiction would become a spectacle. The guests watched with the hungry interest people always had when hoping for scandal. The little clue, Alison's comment about wax, hung in Hamish's mind. The smear had been small, almost nothing, but it felt deliberate. Blair had dismissed it with a snort. Hamish didn't trust Alison either, not entirely. She was too calm, too careful, but the clue was worth considering. Blair stomped toward the door. "Anderson! Lock Ian McLean in the spare guest room. Keep him there until we can move him out. We'll question him properly once I've had a decent meal." As he thundered out, villagers stepped aside quickly, as if avoiding a charging bull. The castle manager fluttered after him, wringing his hands until it looked painful. Guests murmured, relieved that someone had been blamed, even if wrongly. Hamish stood there feeling the weight of it settle on him. His failure to speak clearly, his half-answers, his uncertainty. Lochdu would hear every detail before nightfall, and by the morning they would all say Hamish Macbeth had let Blair carry away one of their own without lifting a finger. Lugs pressed against his leg again, tail low. Hamish looked down at the dog, then back at the empty doorway where Ian had disappeared. Something was wrong, and now Blair's heavy hand had made it worse. Hamish took a slow breath, the air tasting of lukewarm coffee and humiliation. He knew the case had just twisted in the wrong direction, and he had let it happen. He walked to the ballroom, needing space, though he would never admit it. The window still would not close properly. The smear of wax sat there, small and stubborn. Hamish touched it lightly with his thumb and felt only cold. Something here mattered, and he had just lost ground before even starting. Blair's snores were the first thing wrong. They shook the walls of the commandeered guest suite like some trapped animal. Hamish could hear them even from the corridor, low and miserable. No one in Tommel Castle was sleeping well, but Blair made sure the rest slept worse. Hamish had no wish to return to his own cold station either, so he drifted through the castle's dim passages, lugs padding behind him with quiet, patient steps. It was not a thoughtful walk. He simply needed distance from Blair's voice, even when unconscious. The generator had been lowered to half power. The lights flickered in long breaths, throwing odd shadows across the old wallpaper. A draught slipped along his ankles. Hamish frowned. The ballroom was on the other side of that wall. He followed the cold air until he found a narrow side corridor leading from the service wing toward the ballroom. The linoleum floor was scuffed in uneven patterns, as if people hurried through it without wanting to be seen. He stepped inside. The emergency light above the far door flickered a sickly yellow. Hamish knelt and ran a hand along the skirting board. A long scrape travelled across the paint, exactly at hip height. Someone had been shoved there or steadied themselves in a panic. A few dark fibres clung to the wood. He pinched one, too fine to be from Ian's rough coat. Something softer, maybe from a woman's sleeve. He stood slowly. Blair had all but announced that only Ian could have delivered the fatal push in the ballroom doorway. But this corridor led straight to the same spot from behind. Someone could have met Colin here, not in front of the guests. Lugs whined softly, his ears twitching at the draught. Hamish rubbed the dog's head. "Aye, something's not right," he murmured. His voice sounded small in the long passage. He pushed open a door to a tiny staff sitting room. Two maids sat there with cups of tea gone cold. They startled when they saw him, glancing at each other like guilty schoolgirls. Hamish stepped in, shutting the door behind him. "You two were working last night?" he asked. They nodded. One stared at her hands. The other straightened her back, as if trying to look braver than she felt. "Tell me what you heard," Hamish said. "I ken folk talk. Help me understand how things were before the fall." The braver of the two let out a shaky breath. "He was raging, that man," she said. "Colin. He said he'd sue the castle, said he'd have it shut down within a year. We heard him laughing about it." "Laughing?" Hamish repeated, surprised. "Aye, laughing. Said the place was a death trap and he'd prove it." Her friend nodded vigorously but kept her eyes lowered. "He scared the mistress," she whispered. "Said he kent lawyers." Hamish leaned a shoulder against the door. "And did you hear anyone speak with him? Anyone arguing?" The first maid hesitated, then nodded. "A woman. Sharp voice, not staff. Who? The second maid spoke so faintly he almost missed it. We didnae see proper. Hamish narrowed his eyes. Didn't he see or didn't he want to say? They looked at one another again, twin mirrors of fear. The braver one swallowed. We need our jobs, constable. Folk can ruin you quick. He knew pressing harder would only close their mouths entirely. Fine, he said. But if you recall something, you call for me. They nodded without promising anything. Hamish stepped back into the corridor. Lugg sniffed at the scrape on the skirting board again, not solving anything, only sharing the tension. As Hamish walked toward the ballroom, he heard faint footsteps behind him. He turned. Alison Drake approached, pale and perfectly composed in the half-light. Luggs gave a low growl, a warning rather than aggression. Alison paused at the sound and smiled faintly. He's protective, she said softly. He's sensible, Hamish replied. She stepped nearer, her shoes soundless on the linoleum. Inspector Blair seems very certain of himself, she said, as if making idle conversation. Hamish shrugged. Blair's certain of himself, even when he's wrong. Her gaze flicked to the scuffed floor, then back to him. They say Ian pushed the man in the ballroom, but the angle, well, it hardly matters what I think. Blair doesn't listen to observers. Hamish stiffened slightly. Blair had not told anyone about the supposed push. Not officially. The guests should not know that detail. He studied her, but Alison's expression remained mild, uninterested. Folk talk, he said, keeping his voice flat. Word travels. She gave a small hum, neither agreeing nor disagreeing. Still, it is a shame for the handyman. He looked terrified when they took him away. Hamish bristled at that. He didn't do himself any favours. No, she said, with a sympathetic tone that somehow sounded like a judgment. Innocent men rarely do. Before he could reply, she moved past him toward the stairs. Her perfume, faint and expensive, lingered in the corridor. Lugs growled again, a soft, uncertain sound. Hamish stood alone for a moment, staring at the long scrape on the wall. A woman's voice arguing, a finer fibre. Alison knowing details she should not. And Blair, snoring above it all, convinced he had already solved the case by shouting loudest. Hamish rubbed his forehead. He could feel the weight of the thing settling on him again, heavier now that he had evidence Blair would refuse to consider. He could not even voice it without being mocked, or worse, flattened by Blair's temper in front of the guests. He walked slowly back toward the main corridor. He was no longer convinced Ian had touched Colin, but he had neither courage nor proof enough to challenge Blair yet, and each hour strengthened Blair's claims in the villagers' minds. Hamish reached the shadowy corner where the service wing opened into the grand hall. The castle groaned in the cold, old wood, protesting the winter like an elderly man rising from bed. Lugs pressed against Hamish's knee. Hamish rested a hand on the dog's head. Aye, I ken. It's getting worse. He glanced once more at the corridor behind him, the scrape on the wall barely visible now under the weak light, and felt the uneasy tug of truth he could not yet use. He walked on, tired and unsure, the cold following him like a shadow. The morning began wrong. Hamish knew it the moment he stepped out of the station and sank half a boot deep in slush that had frozen again overnight. The sky hung low and colourless, the kind of sky that made the whole of Loch Dhu look as though it had been forgotten by the rest of the world. Lugs whined at the cold and pressed close to Hamish's leg, his breath coming out in little puffs. The worst of the storm had passed, but nothing worked properly afterward. Roads were blocked, tempers were up, and every villager believed the police should somehow control the weather. Hamish trudged on. He had to reach Donald McNabb's croft at the far edge of the village. McNabb had taken in the retired colonel during the worst of the storm, and Hamish needed to speak to him about the night of Colin's death. It felt like an errand meant for someone with more authority, but Blair had barked after Ian's arrest that Hamish could make himself useful and question the yokels. Blair's idea of delegation always felt like punishment. The track to the croft was churned with mud under the snow, and Hamish slipped more than once. A sulky hen stood in the byre doorway, feathers puffed out, glaring at Hamish as though he had personally ordered the weather. It refused to move when Lugs trotted near, and Lugs gave it a respectful distance, perhaps sensing it was meaner than it looked. Donald McNabb opened the door before Hamish could knock. He was a broad man with a permanent scowl, the kind of man who believed the world should apologize to him. "I kent it'd be you," he muttered. "Police only come when there's trouble." Hamish stepped inside without being invited. "There is trouble, Donald. A man's dead." McNab snorted. "Folk die, especially fools who think they can fight weather and whiskey both." Hamish ignored that. The inside of the croft was cramped and dark, the peat fire giving off more smoke than heat. The colonel stood awkwardly near the hearth, holding a chipped mug as if it were delicate porcelain. He brightened when he saw Hamish. "Awful business, what?" "Terrible thing," the colonel said, though the tone suggested he enjoyed recounting it. "I heard footsteps, you know, and a scent. Perfume, I dare say." McNab shot him a warning look, and the colonel retreated into a mutter. Hamish turned to McNab. "I've heard you were outside with your dog at the time." McNab stiffened. "Folk talk too much." Hamish let the silence stretch. The fire popped loudly. McNab glared at the flames as though they'd betrayed him. Finally he said, I was outside. Dog needed out. Snow was up to my knees, mind." "And did you see anyone?" McNab rubbed his hands together, the skin cracked from cold and work. "Might have seen something." Hamish waited. It was always better not to push until the last moment. McNab sighed. "There was a figure," he said at last. "Came out the service entrance of the castle, hood up, head down, walked fast across the yard, keeping low against the snow." "Man or woman?" Hamish asked. "Didn't he see?" McNab stared at the fire again. "Storm was bad. Could have been anyone." "But you ken who it was," Hamish said quietly. He had that feeling, the small tug of intuition that never explained itself. McNab's jaw tightened. "I ken nothing." "You ken something, and keeping quiet might see Ian in jail." McNab's head snapped up. "He's not my concern." "That's a cold thing to say," Hamish replied. McNab's eyes hardened. "Crofters have their own troubles. The castle's taken payment for grazing and done nothing. That place bleeds folk dry. If someone wanted revenge on one of them guests or managers, who am I to say different?" Hamish studied him. "This isn't about revenge. A man is dead. Folk die," McNab repeated, "and folk who poke their noses in get punished. You should ken that better than most." Hamish felt the rebuke more sharply than expected. He had stepped wrong in the village lately, and everyone knew it, even Donald McNab. The colonel cleared his throat in a grandiose way that suggested he intended to offer wisdom. "I say," he began, "there was a scent, a woman's perfume, very particular. Reminded me of Cairo, 1952. Dreadful business that was." "Nobody asked you," McNab barked. Hamish tried to salvage something useful. "Colonel, where exactly were you when you smelled it?" The colonel blinked behind his fog spectacles. "Where was I? Oh, somewhere outside. Or inside. Hard to recall, you know. Terrible storm." Hamish bit back a sigh. The man's recollections were about as reliable as Blair's manners. He tried McNab again. "If the figure was Ian, you'd have said, 'You're no friend of his, but you're no liar either.'" McNab's face closed like a slammed door. "I said what I said." Hamish made one last attempt, softly, the way he spoke when coaxing shy animals. "Donald, this could save a man's life." McNab shook his head, stubborn as the mountain itself. "Nay more about it. You can see yourself out." Hamish felt irritation prick his skin, but he held it back. He stood, nodded stiffly, and opened the door. The cold air rushed in, startling the hen, which flapped indignantly. Lugs barked sharply, ears pricked toward the byre roof. For a tense second, Hamish wondered if something, or someone, was up there. Then the snow slid off in a heavy sheet, crashing to the ground. Lugs barked again, then looked embarrassed. McNab gave a humourless snort. "Your beast's as jumpy as you are." Hamish stepped outside, pulling his collar up. He walked a few yards before stopping to look back at the croft. McNab's figure was framed in the doorway, arms crossed, daring him to return. The man was hiding something, but Hamish doubted it was murder. There was old resentment in him, the sort that grew between crofters and castle owners over too many winters. Resentment did strange things to people's honesty. Hamish trudged back toward the village, snow crunching underfoot. His mind turned over the refusal, the scrape in the corridor, the fibres on the skirting board, and Alison's strange knowledge. Ian was an easy scapegoat, and Blair loved an easy suspect. but nothing sat right. He thought of McNabb's grazing arrears, whispered about in Patel's shop weeks ago. Money shame made folk behave oddly, hiding their troubles like wounded animals. It could explain his silence, or it could point to something deeper. Hamish could not tell yet. Lugs pressed close, glancing back toward the croft with a low huff. Hamish reached down and gave the dog's head a quick stroke. "Aye," he muttered. "I dinny trust it either." The road stretched pale and empty toward Loch Dhu, and Hamish felt the weight of another failure settle on his shoulders. He had not pulled the thread when he needed to. He had let McNabb close up, same as he had let Ian be dragged off without proper defence. Each mistake tightened the knot strangling the case. By the time the village came into view, Hamish's boots were soaked through and his patience thin. A fisher passed him without greeting, giving him the sideways look of someone deciding whether he approved of Hamish today. That was answer enough. Hamish stepped into the station. The fire had died again. The room felt as cold as the croft. Lugs shook snow off his coat and curled in his usual corner. Hamish stood in the centre of the room, staring at nothing in particular. The silence was thick. He could feel the case shifting in the dark, but he had no way yet to force it into the light. He rubbed his face with both hands, weary and irritated. "McNabb's hiding something," he said aloud, because the emptiness demanded sound. "But it's not murder, so what is it?" Lugs thumped his tail once, offering no answer. Hamish sat heavily at his desk, staring at Blair's paperwork he had no intention of completing. The storm was easing outside, but inside the investigation only grew more knotted. And Hamish knew, with the dull certainty that came from experience, that he was already running behind. Something was already wrong before Hamish even reached the castle. Blair's men had tramped muddy snow through half the corridors, and someone had left a tray of cold tea blocking the stairwell. Lugs hesitated at the spill as though considering turning back. Hamish felt the same. He had spent the morning being stared at in Loch Dhu as if he'd personally handed Ian to the gallows, and now the castle loomed ahead like another round of trouble. Inside, the heat was patchy, and the lights flickered whenever the generator coughed. Hamish made for the small sitting room near the back, wanting a moment's quiet before Blair found him. Instead, he found Alison Drake sitting alone, her notebook open on her knee, though the pen beside it looked untouched. She did not look up at once. Her gaze rested on the window where the snow had begun drifting sideways again. When she finally noticed him, she gave a small, tired smile. "Constable Macbeth, you look chilled." "It's Scotland," Hamish said. "Folk get chilled." She nodded as though he'd said something profound. "He was a difficult man, you know. Colin. Difficult in ways people never admit." She spoke slowly, her voice low enough to seem intimate without being familiar. "He ruined 2 small hotels with reviews he twisted for sport. And he tried to blackmail me once, over something stupid I did years ago. He held it over me whenever he wanted cooperation." Hamish shifted, awkward in the small room. Her calmness unsettled him more than tears might have. "Folk argue with hotel staff all the time," he said. "That doesn't make them targets." "No," she agreed. "But it makes them hated. Ian isn't the only one he provoked." She looked down at her hands. "You must understand. Men like Colin make enemies everywhere. Ian is just one of many." Her steadiness, her restraint, the quiet misery in her voice, all of it tugged at Hamish against his better judgment. He always misread polished people, especially ones who didn't shout. She didn't smell of guilt or fear, only expensive soap and tiredness. He found himself leaning against the radiator, arms crossed. "I'll not let Blair dump this on the wrong man," Hamish said before he could stop himself. Alison's head lifted, though she didn't smile. "Thank you," she said. "Some people here seem eager to settle for the easiest explanation." Lugs sighed deeply and curled closer to the radiator. Hamish envied the dog's certainty that warmth was the only thing worth caring about. Alison traced a circle on her notebook cover. "That ballroom window," she murmured. "The catch was loose before last night. I noticed it when I checked the draft for my notes, and there was a candle stub on the sill. Very odd." Hamish blinked. "A candle?" "Yes. Someone must have been at the window earlier. Perhaps they were checking the airflow, or perhaps something else." She spoke lightly, as though it were only idle curiosity. "I didn't think much of it until today." Hamish felt a nudge of suspicion, but only a faint one. Alison seemed careful by nature, observant. Journalists were like that. He nodded, pocketing the information without yet attaching warning to it. When Blair summoned him to the lounge, Hamish repeated her comment, hoping it might shift Blair's focus away from Ian. Blair snorted loudly. "A candle? That's the kind of tosh folk write when they canna get a real story. Stop wasting my time, Macbeth." The humiliation rolled over Hamish like cold water. Anderson smirked behind Blair's shoulder until Blair cuffed him for smirking. Priscilla, standing near the fireplace with a cup of untouched tea, watched Hamish with that cool, unreadable expression that made him wish he'd worn a better shirt, or none at all. The insurance man, meanwhile, held court near the centre rug. He waved papers about, announcing in a cheerful tone that unexpected fatalities often voided certain clauses, but that he personally was well protected. He sounded delighted by the drama, as if compensation tables thrilled him. Priscilla rounded on him. "A man is dead, Mr. Watkins. Have some decency." Watkins blinked as though decency were a foreign word. "Just being practical," he said. "Nothing wrong with numbers." "Everything is wrong with your timing," she replied coldly. Several guests murmured agreement, and for once Hamish felt a flicker of gratitude toward her. Watkins retreated, shuffling his papers like a dog rearranging stolen socks. Hamish stepped back into the sitting room after Blair dismissed him. Alison looked up again, her eyes cool but gentler than before. "No progress?" she asked. "Blair's not interested in progress," Hamish muttered, "only in shouting till someone agrees with him." She gave a small huff of breath, almost a laugh. "He seems very taken with the idea of Ian as the culprit." Hamish hesitated. "Ian's temper is one thing, murder's another. It doesn't feel right." "Of course not," she said softly. "You can see that. Thank goodness at least one person here can." Hamish felt himself straighten a little. Foolish, really. But the approval warmed him more than the radiator did. Lugs rolled over, stretching his legs as though giving up on the adults entirely. Alison returned her gaze to the snow outside. "Someone like Colin. He could twist anything. He did it to me, and I had barely met him. If he'd found out about the castle's maintenance issues, he'd have destroyed them too. You can imagine the pressure." Hamish nodded. It matched the stories he'd heard. Nasty, sharp-tongued men did invite retribution. The easiest explanation had never been Ian. Watkins now. He had looked smug too early. A man delighted by the idea of risk assessments and payouts. Hamish found himself looking toward the lounge, imagining Watkins rubbing his hands with glee. Perhaps that had been it all along. Maybe the man had something to gain. Blair would call him an idiot, but Blair had called Hamish worse today. Hamish looked back at Alison. "If anything else comes to you, anything at all, you'll let me know." "Of course." She closed her notebook gently. "I trust you to do the right thing." No one said that to Hamish often. He felt it land on him, heavy and flattering in equal measure. He stood then, awkward, suddenly aware that he had spent too long in one room with one elegant woman. Lugs rose and shook himself, as if waking from a sleep he had never actually entered. As Hamish stepped out into the corridor, he heard Watkins once again boasting about claim thresholds. Blair barked at Anderson for breathing too loudly. The castle trembled with too much heat in some corners and too little in others, a badly managed house echoing its badly managed guests. Hamish paused at the end of the hall. He thought of the candle stub, the loose catch, the scrape in the corridor, Alison's soft voice painting herself as one more victim in Colin's long trail of harm. He pushed the doubt aside too quickly. He should have known better, but he didn't. He placed her neatly into the category of people who needed protecting. Watkins, meanwhile, slid into the category of people who needed investigating. A tidy arrangement. Too tidy. Hamish set his jaw and walked back toward the lounge. A mistake forming, though he couldn't see it yet. By the time he reached the fire, the guests were whispering again. Watkins watched him with the smugness of a man who believed he had already calculated the entire room. Priscilla gave Hamish one brief, cool glance before turning away. Hamish felt the error take root inside him. Subtle, quiet, like a crack beneath snow. But he mistook it for progress. Lugs nudged his leg, uneasy. Hamish ignored the warning. The next day, after the generator faltered again, the Kirk Hall filled a second time, more crowded, colder, and far more bad-tempered than before. He could hear shouting from halfway down the lane, the kind of rising, panicky noise that meant villagers had decided to take matters into their own hands. The castle's generators had begun flickering again, and a group from Lochdew had marched up and insisted the guests be moved somewhere with a proper peat stove. Now the guests, the villagers, and half the castle staff were crammed into one draughty hall that had never been meant to hold this many tempers. Hamish pushed open the door. Heat blasted out unevenly from the old iron stove, and the air smelled of soup, wet coats, and accusation. Tables had been dragged into odd shapes as people claimed territory like squabbling hens. Lugs trotted in beside him and immediately began pacing, ears twitching at every raised voice. A tourist woman announced loudly, "This is unacceptable. We paid for a proper holiday, not a refugee camp." Patel snapped back, "We dinna want ye here either, madam, but the castle's power's failing." The woman gasped as though slapped. Her husband muttered that perhaps they should risk driving out in the storm after all. The retired colonel butted in, declaring loudly that cowards shouldn't travel, which earned him glares from both villagers and tourists. At the front, the minister attempted a gentle speech about patience and community. No one listened. His voice was swallowed by Watkins, the insurance man, who was in full performance. "This was a preventable accident," Watkins said, waving a folder. "The castle ignored maintenance issues, and a man died. There are grounds here, serious grounds, for compensation." Priscilla stepped forward so sharply that even Lugg stopped pacing. "Mr. Watkins," she said, voice icy enough to still the room, "you came here to profit from other people's misfortune, and you're doing it again. Kindly stop." Watkins, unused to being contradicted by someone colder than himself, blinked. "I'm simply stating facts." "You're stirring panic," Priscilla replied, "and showing more interest in payouts than in a dead man." The colonel backed her noisily. "Here, here, damned parasites, these insurance chaps." A few villagers snorted. Hamish saw the nervous young couple edging toward the door. "We should go," the man whispered. "Storm or not." Hamish had had enough. He grabbed a wooden spoon from the nearest table and banged it hard against a tin tray. The clang rang through the hall like a gunshot. "Sit down," he barked, "all of ye, or someone's earning a night in the cells." The hall fell into a grudging hush. A few people sat too loudly to show they weren't impressed. Watkins muttered about police sentimentality. Priscilla folded her arms. The colonel looked pleased, as if the whole mess were a parade staged for his benefit. Hamish breathed through his nose and tried to sound like someone in control. "We're here to make sure no one freezes, no one starves, and no one causes more trouble. You'll behave." A timid voice piped up from near the stove. One of the maids stood there, wringing her hands. "Sir, I mind something." Hamish looked at her. "Out with it." "The music," she said. "At the Saley. It stopped earlier than Mr. Blair says. I ken it did, because the fuse blew during the reel, the mason's apron. That was before the screaming. Long before." Hamish felt the shift in the room, the quick intake of breath. This would undercut Blair's timeline, and everyone knew it. "Are ye sure?" Hamish asked. "Aye," she said, voice trembling but certain. "I remember because my aunt always danced that tune at Hogmanay." Hamish nodded. It tied neatly with the scrape in the corridor and the fibres he'd found. Ian could not have been where Blair swore he was, not if the timeline was wrong. He stepped aside and told Blair the moment the man arrived, stomping snow off his boots. Blair's response was a dismissive bark. "Maids are aye confused. Couldn't he trust them to boil an egg?" Hamish felt anger spark in his chest, but Blair had already pushed past him to shout at Anderson for losing a clipboard. In the corner of the hall, Alison Drake sat with perfect calm, hands folded in her lap, watching the entire scene like someone attending a play. When Hamish met her eyes, she didn't smile. She simply observed him, the room, and the shifting alliances with a composure that might have been nerves or calculation. He could not tell. Donald McNabb slipped in late, cap low, heading straight for the back row. He avoided Hamish's gaze entirely. Shame or stubbornness, either one kept a man silent. Hamish felt the sting of that silence again. Another thread he could not pull. Tension built like pressure in a cracked boiler. Villagers muttered that the tourists were eating through the soup supply too fast. Tourists complained the hall was freezing, though half of them sat directly in front of the stove. The minister tried another prayer and was drowned out by Watkins describing liability clauses. Hamish slammed the spoon on the tray again. "Quiet." The room fell reluctantly still. "We're not fighting each other," he said. "Not today. Not while there's a killer among us. A few people gasped. Blair, who had arrived in time to hear only that line, rounded on Hamish. "Don't you be spreading panic, Macbeth. There's no killer unless I say there is." Hamish nearly retorted, but the room was watching, hungry for conflict. He closed his mouth, jaw tight. That silence cost him. He saw it in the villagers' eyes, the doubt, the disappointment. Blair's contempt had chipped at Hamish's authority so thoroughly that even doing nothing now looked weak. Lugs whined and pressed against Hamish's leg, sensing the rise of emotion but offering no solution, only sympathy he couldn't show in return. Priscilla stepped away from the stove, striped by its light. She didn't look at Hamish, but he felt the cool distance radiating off her all the same. Maybe she agreed with him, maybe she didn't. But she wasn't standing beside him, and that was what everyone noticed. When the hall finally settled into a sullen truce, Hamish stood alone near the stove, coat damp from melted snow. The noise had reduced to murmurs, the kind that would grow again the moment he left. Blair had taken control by shouting. Watkins had fanned flames with numbers. Priscilla had put the man in his place but made no promises to Hamish. Alison watched from her seat, unreadable. McNab had given him nothing, and the maid's clue, the one piece of truth in the room, would be dismissed by Blair the moment he could spin it so. As people dispersed into corners to sulk or gossip, Hamish felt the crack widening under his feet. Authority was slipping from him, trust thinning like ice after a thaw. He stood quite still, lugs leaning gently into his leg, and understood that the village, the tourists, and Blair had all drifted into separate camps, and he, awkward and red-haired and tired, stood in the cold middle of them, with nothing solid to hold. The first thing wrong was the telephone. It rang in the cramped Kirk office with a harsh, crackling buzz that sounded like it resented working in bad weather. Hamish picked it up, already bracing for Blair's bark. Instead, Daviot's thin, fretful voice seeped through the static. "Macbeth? Is Blair there? Put Blair on. At once. This is delicate." Hamish held the receiver out. Blair snatched it so quickly he almost knocked over the minister's hymn book. Lugs, lying under the table, flinched at the sudden movement. "Aye, sir," Blair said loudly, as if shouting improved reception. "We're making progress, aye. Aye. I ken the press are sniffing about. Aye. Tourism, reputation, of course." Hamish could hear Daviot's anxious murmur even without the receiver. Blair puffed himself up further, chest pushed out like a rooster about to crow. "Aye, well, we'll resolve it sharpish. Nay worry about the hotel being unsafe. We'll steer it another way." Hamish felt the familiar tightening in his stomach. Whenever Strathbane mentioned image, truth came last. Blair slammed the phone down with theatrical flair. "Right," he shouted. "Everyone into the hall, now." Guests and villagers shuffled in reluctantly, the Kirk hall still warm from the earlier row. Watkins, the insurance man, looked up from a stack of papers, blinking like a man dragged from pleasant arithmetic. Blair strode to the centre of the room. "We've new information," he declared, which immediately meant he had no such thing. "Suspicious financial instruments have been found concerning Mr. Watkins here." Watkins made a strangled sound. "Financial what? Those are travel policies. Standard indemnity forms." "Aye," Blair said, pouncing on the weakness. "And ye stand to profit if anything happens to one of your tour members." Watkins' mouth opened and closed rapidly. "The company, my employer, receives payouts, not me personally. I only process—" "Spare us the jargon," Blair interrupted. "Your paperwork's shady as a Glaswegian alley. Come with me." Murmurs spread at once. The colonel looked thrilled. Some tourists nodded as if relieved to have a new villain. Even Patel muttered, "Wouldn't surprise me." Hamish stepped forward. "Hold on. Let's see the paperwork first." Blair turned, eyes narrowing. "What? You doubt me?" "I want to be sure," Hamish said, "before you drag a man's name through the mud." Too late. Blair had already grabbed Watkins by the elbow and marched him toward the vestry. Watkins sputtered the whole way. "It's a basic policy, barely covers lost luggage," Blair shouted back. "That's what criminals always say." Daviot's faint approval crackled from the office phone. "Good initiative, Blair. Contain the situation." Hamish felt a flicker of something bitter. Strathbane had chosen its story, and now the village would be forced to swallow it. While Blair interrogated Watkins loudly enough for the whole Kirk to hear, Hamish gathered the discarded papers. They smelled of ink and cold fingers. The numbers were plain, no surprise clauses, no secret windfalls. The payout, such as it was, went directly to the tour company, not the man now being shouted at by Blair. Weak motive, barely a motive at all. Hamish re-entered the vestry. "Blair," he said quietly, "the policy's standard. Watkins couldn't gain anything." Blair rounded on him. "Do you want the chief breathing down my neck? Let it be, Macbeth. Let it be." Watkins whimpered. Blair ignored him entirely. Hamish walked out before he said something he'd regret. Lugs followed, tail tucked, ears flat from the noise. Outside the vestry, villagers exchanged uneasy glances. Tourists whispered. People liked a tidy story even when it ruined someone innocent. And Blair had provided one with gusto. Priscilla intercepted Hamish near the stove, her posture immaculate despite the chaos around them. "Hamish," she said quietly, "can you not simply agree with Blair for once and let it end? The castle cannot survive scandal. We cannot have guests leaving thinking this place is unsafe." Hamish stared at her. Her face was as composed as a marble statue, but strain pulled at the edges of her voice. "If we hang the wrong man," Hamish said, "it will not end. It'll only bury the truth." She inhaled sharply, then looked away, arms folded in a gesture that shut the world out, particularly him. Across the hall, the minister pretended to tidy hymn sheets. Patel whispered something to the colonel, who nodded solemnly, though he had heard none of it. A couple of tourists were arguing about whether they should demand refunds. Lugs whined softly, unsettled by the rising tension. Hamish leaned against the kirk wall and rubbed his temple with the heel of his hand. Pressure pressed down on him from every side. The village wanting calm, the castle wanting silence, Strathbane wanting headlines that made them look decisive, and Blair, strutting about with his new suspect, was all too happy to comply. Hamish looked at the hall full of divided faces, locals glaring at tourists, tourists glaring at locals, and everyone glaring at him for different reasons. He felt the weight of the wrongness settling again, thick and cold. The storm outside had eased, but a worse one was gathering in the kirk hall, and Hamish knew he was being pushed into choosing between peace and truth. Neither choice looked likely to save him. The trouble began before Hamish even left the station. The snowplough had carved only a grudging path through the upper road, and overnight, frost had turned the slush into rutted ice that pulled at a man's ankles. The telephone crackled on and off, mostly off. The fire had sunk low again, and the room smelled of wet wool and peat ash. Lugs whimpered once at the cold and pressed himself deeper into his blanket. Hamish felt no better. Lochdu was fraying at the edges, and he, somehow, was at the centre of every frayed thread. By the time he made it down to Patel's shop, the village was already awake and already cross. A crofter stormed past him on the street, muttering about lost bookings and fancy tourists nae worth the bother. Another man trudged by with a sack of feed over his shoulder, giving Hamish a curt nod and nothing else. The storm had trapped them all, but the murder had trapped them worse. Inside the shop, the stove spat weak heat. People crowded near it more for conversation than warmth. Hamish stepped in, stamping snow from his boots, and the chatter dropped to a pinched murmur. "Oh, look who it is," said Mrs. Cameron, sharp-tongued as a gull pecking at a fish head. "Hamish always has to be clever. Never enough to let the proper police handle things." Her friend, Mrs. Forbes, sniffed loudly. "Aye, never did know when to leave things be. If Blair says the man's guilty, then he's guilty. Shouldn't he drag it out?" Hamish felt the sting of it. He tried not to show it. Lugs pressed against his leg. Sensing trouble in the rising voices, Patel glanced nervously toward the front window, as though scandal might be written on the glass for the whole world to read. Hamish said quietly, "A man's life is at stake. I'll not apologise for being careful." Mrs. Cameron lifted her eyebrows high enough to suggest that care was a useless hobby. "And what about our lives, Hamish Macbeth? Bookings cancelled, the castle behind on payments, half the village counting on winter guests that aren't coming, folk are drowning in bills and you're standing in the way of closure." Hamish opened his mouth, then shut it again. Any reply would only harden the mood. Patel stepped in then, clearing his throat. Now, you cannae blame Hamish for the weather." "Who's blaming the weather?" Mrs. Forbes shot back. "We're blaming him." Lugs let out a soft growl, more hurt than angry. Hamish reached down and scratched behind his ear. Patel moved closer to Hamish, dropping his voice. "You're in a difficult spot, my friend. Folk are scared, and when people are scared, they pick an easy target." Hamish muttered, "I dinna want to be anyone's target." Patel offered a tired smile. Too late for that. He handed Hamish a loaf of bread and a packet of tea. Before Hamish could pay, Patel leaned in again. "Someone was using my payphone a great deal before the storm hit," he whispered, arguing softly about money, debt, deadlines. It was not Colin alone. Hamish frowned. "You're sure?" "Aye. 2 calls at least. One from a woman, one from a man. Both sounded desperate, both before the storm shut us in." This added another knot to the tangle. Money trouble was everywhere. Tour company, castle accounts, villagers behind on grazing fees. Everyone owed everyone something. Behind them, Mrs. Cameron said loudly, "Even Ian's own family wonders if he's innocent. And Hamish, they're still playing at mysteries." Hamish turned, stung despite himself. "Ian's a good man." "That's no proof," Mrs. Forbes snapped. He paid Patel and left before he said something sharp enough to damage things further. On his way out, Mrs. Cameron muttered loudly enough for all to hear, "Maybe he's holding something back." The suggestion hit the room like sleet. People turned. Some nodded, some frowned. All of them wondered. Hamish stepped into the cold with lugs at his heels, feeling the shift in the village like a door closing. He walked toward the castle, but his steps slowed near the post office. Mrs. McLean stood outside, adjusting her scarf. She looked up at him with an expression that used to be warm, but now felt cautious. "Hamish," she said stiffly. "Mrs. McLean." She hesitated, then asked, "Is it true you found something in that corridor?" "Aye," he said, "but it's not conclusive." She lowered her voice. "Folks say you're protecting someone else." "I'm protecting the truth," Hamish replied, but it sounded pompous even to him, and her expression told him she heard it too. She shook her head and went inside, another door closing. Lugs whined, the sound thin and unhappy. "Aye," Hamish murmured, "we're getting less welcome by the hour." Back at Tommel Castle, Hamish found Blair strutting through the lounge with the energy of a man who had found a new excuse to throw his weight around. Anderson followed behind him carrying a pile of unrelated papers, sweating from the effort of trying to look useful. Blair saw Hamish and smirked. "Your village is finally seeing sense, Macbeth. They're tired of your dithering." Hamish ignored him. He went to the reception desk where Priscilla was reviewing a stack of forms with a frown sharp enough to cut thread. "Priscilla," he said quietly, "any more cancellations?" She didn't look up. "4 this morning, possibly more if the press sniff trouble." Hamish shifted awkwardly. "It's not your fault." At that she lifted her gaze, cool and distant. "Fault doesn't matter when bills arrive." She tapped the papers. "The castle needs a resolution, Hamish, quickly." "So, I should lie?" he asked. She didn't flinch. "I didn't say that." "You dinny have to." He regretted the sharpness immediately, but her face had already closed. Blair stomped back over, eager for another audience. "Macbeth's too soft," he told Priscilla loudly. "He'd let the killer walk if they said something sad enough." Priscilla didn't defend Hamish. That hurt more than Blair's taunts. Hamish turned away, jaw tight. Lugs followed, tail low. He retreated to the servants' corridor where he could think without someone blaming him for the weather. But thinking did little to ease the twist in his stomach. Money trouble everywhere. Phone calls before the storm. A candle stub at the window. Fibres on the corridor wall. Alison's quiet, steady voice telling him she'd been blackmailed once before, and he had believed her too quickly. A door creaked behind him. Patel had arrived to deliver supplies. He motioned Hamish aside and spoke low. "There's more. About the phone calls." Hamish straightened. "Go on." Patel lowered his voice further. Alison also made a call. Just before the lines went down, she asked for a transfer, sounded desperate, begged for funds, said she needed it before he ruined everything. Hamish felt the floor tilt. "You're sure?" "Aye." She was shaking. It was a clue, a large one that cut across the sympathy he'd built around her like a nest of twigs. Yet the thought of suspecting her twisted something sour inside him. He didn't want to revisit the careful, gentle tone she'd used, the way he had believed it. Patel gave him a searching look. "Hamish, you must consider every angle." Hamish nodded, but said nothing. He would not yet recast her as a suspect. Stubbornness or pride or something more foolish held him still. When he left the castle and returned to the village, the mood had worsened. People muttered behind hands. A crofter's wife whispered, "He's meddling too much." Another said, "Maybe Ian should have kept his mouth shut if he's innocent." Even children looked at Hamish with the wide-eyed awe usually reserved for the monster in bedtime stories. Lugg stayed so close to his leg that Hamish nearly tripped over him twice. At last, he reached the station. The room was bleak and cold, the fire little more than a red glow buried under ash. He stirred it half-heartedly until a flame grudgingly rose. He sat down heavily at his desk. The silence pressed around him like damp cloth. For once, even Luggs hesitated before coming to lie at his feet. Lochdu had always protected him, even when mocking him. But now the village was shifting. The quiet shield he'd never acknowledged was slipping away, and he was more alone in that cold room than he had been in years. A faint crack of ice slid off the station roof, echoing the split inside him, a truth he did not want to face, and a village that no longer trusted him to find it. The day started badly and slid downhill from there. Hamish had barely stepped into the castle's service corridor when he heard Blair roaring like a bull shut indoors too long. The man's voice bounced off the stone walls, thick with triumph. That alone meant trouble. Luggs hesitated at the doorway, ears flattening. Hamish understood the feeling. Blair burst out of the laundry room, dragging a maid by the elbow. She was crying in sharp, miserable bursts, her apron twisted in her hands. Blair shoved her into the main corridor as if presenting evidence. "Caught her red-handed," he announced. "A thief, a liar. Staff like this make a mockery of honest police work." The maid hiccuped. "It was just a wee ring. I was going to put it back." "Put it back?" Blair barked a laugh. "Aye, and the loch might boil before that happens." Hamish stepped forward. "What night did you take it?" "The night the storm came in," she whispered. "When the Salith music stopped. I was in the rooms then, not anywhere near the ballroom." Blair gave Hamish a glare. She'll say anything to save her skin, but Hamish heard the steadiness beneath her tears. She was ashamed, not sly. "If she was upstairs rifling drawers," he said softly, "then she didn't push anyone." "That's for me to decide, not you," Blair snapped, but even he seemed to sense the weakness of his argument. He tightened his grip on the maid, using her shame as a shield for his own blunder. Luggs let out a low, unhappy whine. Blair sneered down at him. "Your mutt knows lies when he hears them, does he?" Hamish didn't rise to it. He watched the maid scuttle away once Blair released her, shoulders hunched as though shrinking from every pair of eyes in the corridor. Another life bruised by the storm. Another tangle of small sins masking the bigger one. In the kitchen, steam clouded the windows, and the air smelled of onions fried too long. The barman stood by the back door, fiddling with his waistcoat buttons. He looked up guiltily when Hamish entered. "Macbeth," he said, voice low, "I need to tell you something." Hamish waited. People always confessed in kitchens. Something about heat and noise loosened tongues. "I didn't lock that side door. I told Blair I had. I told you too," he swallowed. "I slipped out for a smoke just for a minute, left it on the latch." Hamish's stomach dropped. He had built half his reasoning around that door being shut tight. Every theory, every question asked, hinged on it. "Why lie?" Hamish asked. "Because Blair would have had my job, and because I thought maybe it didn't matter." "It matters," Hamish said bluntly. Before the man could answer, Blair strode in, Anderson trailing behind like a badly balanced trolley. Blair caught the tail end of the confession. "Aha!" he crowed. "There's your great detective, Macbeth, building castles on sand." The cooks looked away. The kitchen boy ducked behind a crate. Even the clatter of pans paused. Hamish felt his face heat. He didn't defend himself. Anything he said would be snatched up and used against him. Blair smirked as if he'd scored a point in a game only he enjoyed. "You keep stumbling about, and I'll keep doing the real work." Luggs eased closer to Hamish's leg, ears low, sensing the humiliation even without understanding the words. Later, as the kitchen fell back into its ordinary noise, the youngest kitchen boy tugged Hamish's sleeve. "Sir, I saw something." Hamish crouched. "Go on." The boy glanced nervously at the others. "It was the lady journalist, the one called Alison. I saw her walking past the service stairs before the lights went out, toward the ballroom. She had a dark coat on, looked expensive. Hamish straightened slowly. "Are you sure it was before the fuse blew?" "Aye, I remember because Cook shouted at me for dropping a tray right after. The song hadn't stopped yet." That small detail slid into place like a pin clicking into a lock. The scrape on the skirting board, the dark fibres, Alison claiming she stayed in her room, her calm voice, her quiet misery that had seemed too modest to be false. Hamish tried to dismiss it. People walked everywhere in a storm. Coats brushed walls all the time. Innocent explanations were easier to believe, and he had already believed them. But the boy persisted. She looked upset, like she was going to tell someone something. Hamish managed a nod. "Thank ye." The boy, relieved to be done, scurried off to the dish sink. Luggs sniffed the air as if expecting Alison herself to appear. When Hamish stepped back into the corridor, Blair leaned against the wall, arms crossed, expression pleased. "Making progress, are you? Maybe next you'll accuse the dog." Hamish walked past him. He had no patience left for Blair's gloating. But Blair wasn't finished. "You embarrassed yourself in there," Blair called after him. "And I'll not let you drag this case out just because you can't admit when you're wrong." Hamish kept walking. It was safer than replying. Blair thrived on replies. Hamish went upstairs, hoping for a moment alone, but the castle was too small for privacy now. Guests huddled in hallways, snapping at each other over blankets, hot water and imagined slights. A crofter stood arguing with a tourist about whose turn it was for the kettle. Priscilla swept past with a stack of papers, ignoring everyone except the castle accountant, who trailed after her with a face like a kicked sheep. Hamish slipped into an empty alcove near the ballroom and leaned against the cold wall. Luggs sat heavily beside him. He replayed the boy's words. Alison's coat. Alison's lie. Alison walking into the very corridor where someone had been shoved hard enough to scrape the wood. He remembered how gently she spoke, how her hands trembled just enough to look truthful. He had taken her misery as evidence of innocence. Foolish. Luggs pressed his head against Hamish's knee. Hamish scratched him absently. "Aye," he muttered. "I know." He found Alison in the reading room, sitting with a book open but unread. She smiled faintly as he entered. "You look tired, Constable Macbeth." "Long day," he said. She nodded, serene, too serene. "Have you found anything more?" "Bits and pieces." "Enough to help Ian?" she asked softly. Her question felt too smooth, too ready. Hamish said nothing. Her eyes searched his face, but he kept it blank. Luggs growled once, very quietly. She glanced at the dog. "Still upset, is he? Poor thing." Hamish left without answering. He had no proof, only threads. But the threads were tightening. Back in the kitchen, Blair was making a meal of the maid's theft, waving the stolen ring around like a trophy. The other staff looked ready to bolt. "Thieves and liars," Blair boomed. "That's what we're dealing with. And if one of them killed your man, Macbeth, it'll not surprise me." Hamish said dryly, "The maid's timeline clears her." Blair ignored him. "You hear that? Clears her," he says, "as if petty criminals don't escalate." Hamish turned away. Blair wasn't worth the breath. By evening, the castle was thick with tension. Every false lead had been shaken out, every harmless lie exposed, and still they were no closer. Hamish felt stripped of excuses, stripped of shields. Only the uncomfortable truth remained. Alison's place in the puzzle was no longer the tidy one he'd assigned her. Luggs curled beside him as he sat on a bench near the back stairs, head low, tail unmoving. The dog wasn't anxious, only tired of anger in cramped rooms. Hamish rubbed his face with both hands. Snow pressed at the windows. People whispered lies and half-truths behind every door, and each lie cleared away left him staring more directly at the one person he least wanted to suspect. The night settled early, heavy and unpleasant. Nothing was solved. Everything was shifting. And Hamish Macbeth, for the first time since the storm began, found himself hoping he was wrong. The ballroom felt wrong the moment Hamish stepped inside. It was too quiet, too dim, and too cold, as if the room itself had decided it was finished hosting people and meant to freeze solid before doing so again. The generator had finally given up, leaving only a thin wash of daylight creeping through the tall windows. Luggs padded in behind him and stopped at once, ears flicking. Even the dog knew this place held bad memories. Hamish walked straight to the window Alison had complained about. He didn't bother looking at the rest of the room. There was no point. The polished floor still held the faint track of the night's panic, boot marks, scuffs, hurried steps. All the noise had gone, leaving only the trace of it. He gripped the sash. It refused to move at first, stubborn as any Highland contraption left too long alone. Then, with his thumb braced awkwardly to the side, it shifted just a fraction, enough to let a thread of cold air slip through. "So it does open," he muttered. He pulled it again. The wood moved reluctantly. Not broken, not jammed, just stiff, like something someone might pretend was stuck if they wanted to hide that it wasn't. Lugg sniffed at the sill, then backed away sharply, sneezing at the cold draught. Hamish bent to peer at the edge. The wax smear was still there, thin and pale, clinging to the grain. He touched it and frowned. Not candle drippings from a celebration, too tidy for that. Someone had tested for draughts or checked where a flame would sit steady. A small candle would have balanced well on that narrow ridge. He straightened and stepped back a pace, picturing the room the night Colin died. He saw the scuff on the polished floor again, not wide but deep enough for someone to have lost footing. The line of it was wrong for the main entrance, running instead between the service corridor and the window. "Why would you walk that way, Colin?" Hamish murmured. "Who brought you round through the back?" He crossed to the service door. The handle was cold as iron dipped in ice. He opened it. The short corridor beyond smelled faintly of old dinners and bleach. He remembered the scrape on the skirting board there, the very place someone had been shoved sideways, hard enough to tear fibres loose. He ran his fingers over the mark again. The fibres were fine, not rough like Ian's heavy coat. Something softer, something expensive. Hamish let the door fall shut. He looked from the scuff on the ballroom floor to the window and back again. The angle spoke plainly. Someone had come from the service corridor with Colin, pushed him toward the window, shoved him sideways so he struck the skirting, then kept going. It was too neat for a drunken stumble, too directed. He walked to the window again and unlatched it completely. It shifted enough for him to push half open. Cold air slapped him in the face, sharp and uninvited. He leaned out, studying the snow below. The drift reached nearly halfway up the frame. Only one set of prints showed, punched deep into the softening crust. Those belonged to the rescue effort, not the night of the fall. The storm had been too fierce then for anyone to climb out. They had stayed inside. "So you went back the way you came," Hamish said to the empty room. His breath fogged faintly. He let the sash fall shut with a dull clack. Lugg sat near the centre of the ballroom, ears twitching as if sensing the shift in Hamish's thoughts. "Only a few rooms reach this corridor easy," Hamish went on, mostly to himself. "And hers? Aye, hers is one." He didn't want it to be true. He had been too ready to believe her, too ready to think she was merely frightened, merely observant. He had fallen for the calm voice and the steady eyes. Foolish, he thought, completely foolish. He left the ballroom and headed toward the staff corridor. A pair of maids huddled near the linen cupboard, whispering. Their whispered arguments stopped the instant they saw him, replaced with stiff politeness. "Morning," Hamish said. They nodded, wary as gulls eyeing a dog. "You were in here the night before last," he said. "One of you said something about a draughty window." The younger one blushed. "Yes, sir. Miss Allison asked us about it." "Well, what exactly did she ask?" "Which window had the worst draught?" the girl said. "Said she needed the detail for her article. She was particular about it. Kept saying she wanted to get it right." The other maid added quickly, "And she had a wee candle stub. Asked if there were matches in the ballroom. We told her we didn't keep them there. Too many tapestries." Hamish felt something inside him settle, the way a stone sinks cleanly through water. He kept his face blank. The girls were watching him, trying to decide whether they had said too much, whether they should take it back. They didn't. They only shifted from foot to foot, guilt making them twitchy even though they'd done nothing wrong. "Thank ye," he said quietly. They nodded again and vanished into the nearest room, escaping before he changed his mind and asked more. Hamish walked back to the ballroom. He wasn't sure why. Perhaps to see it again with different eyes. Perhaps because standing still in the corridor meant thinking too clearly about his own mistake. He went to the window, touched the catch, examined the wax, followed the scuff on the floor with his boot. All of it pointed the same way. Someone had brought Colin through the servants' route, someone who knew he would follow if summoned quietly, someone careful enough to test the draught beforehand and smart enough to pretend the window jammed, someone who watched everything and wrote it down. He whispered the thought aloud, harsh and short. "I backed the wrong person." Lugs whined softly, tail sweeping once across the floor, as if he sensed the sting of it. Hamish knelt and scratched behind the dog's ear. "Aye, lad, I ken. I should have seen it sooner." He stood again. The room felt different now, no longer cold, just accusing. The ballroom had been telling the truth the whole time. He had simply chosen not to hear it. Outside, snow pressed against the glass like a second wall. Inside, the air held the shape of a struggle. Hamish Macbeth, lanky and tired and too soft-hearted for his own good, realized he had run out of excuses. The wrong suspect, the wrong sympathies, and now he was standing alone in a ballroom that had just corrected him. He looked once more at the window, the catch, the wax, the scuff. Then he exhaled a slow, rough breath. Time to face what he already knew. The wind battered the Kirkhall doors hard enough to rattle the hinges, and that was wrong, because Blair had sworn the weather was easing. Hamish stood inside the entrance with lugs pressed to his leg, watching the draught curl under the door like a warning. The villagers were already muttering. The tourists were gathering their bags as if one more snowflake might trap them for life. Everything felt jumpy, half-finished, and dangerous. "Road's opening," someone announced breathlessly from the vestibule. "Ploughs cutting through from the council. They'll be here any minute." Instead of relief, a sharp, greedy impatience filled the hall. Tourists surged toward the exit. Villagers began shoving forms and invoices into coat pockets, eager to chase overdue payments the moment the world became reachable again. A crofter grumbled that he'd lost a week's worth of bookings, and someone else hissed that the castle should have closed long before this mess began. Lugs gave a low, uneasy rumble. Hamish didn't blame him. The whole hall felt like a shaken bee's nest. The Kirk office phone shrilled. Patel, nearest to it, snatched the receiver and thrust it toward Hamish as if it might bite him. "Strathbane," he mouthed. Hamish took the receiver. Daviot's thin voice crackled down the line before Hamish could even say hello. "Macbeth, understand this clearly. The roads are practically open. Journalists are already waiting outside the village. I will not have Loch Dhu painted as some lawless backwater where tourists are pushed out of windows. Blair is to finalise matters immediately. Do you hear me?" Hamish said, "Aye," though he doubted Daviot heard anything but his own panic. The line cut off abruptly. Behind him, Blair was barking at the cluster of tourists. "Right. When I call your names, you'll come forward for departure clearance, and dinner whinge about the delay. You're lucky we're letting you go after the fuss you've caused." Hamish walked over. Blair glared at him as if he'd been waiting for the chance. "Before you start," Blair snapped, "I'm sticking with the insurance man. Motive, opportunity, financial instruments. Daviot wants it wrapped." Hamish kept his voice level. "Blair, you've no motive worth calling a motive. The policy pays the tour company, not him." "Dinna lecture me about paperwork," Blair said, shoving a folder at an officer. "I'm sick of your wee theories." "They're not theories. I've checked the corridor and the window, the candle. Alison was there before the lights blew." Blair snorted. "Oh, aye, the grand trap you've imagined. The woman's writing an article. You're dazzled because she speaks nice and keeps her stockings straight." Hamish stiffened. The remark stung because it was close to the truth. Blair leaned in. "And stop trying to impress Priscilla Halberton-Smythe. It's pathetic." Priscilla, unfortunately arriving at that exact moment, heard enough to make her expression tighten. "I am not part of this conversation," she said coldly. "Aye, ye are," Blair said. "Half the trouble started because posh folk like you think you can run a circus in a ruined castle and call it hospitality." Priscilla didn't rise to it. She simply walked past, her chin high, but Hamish felt the rebuke anyway. Outside, the heavy growl of machinery signalled that the ploughs were nearing the Kirk. Tourists surged again, clutching bags, shoving sleeves into coats, stepping on one another's toes. Alison stood near the door, her suitcase already upright beside her. She dressed neatly, as if she were walking into a hotel lobby rather than fleeing a crime scene. Her calmness was sharper than any panic. Hamish stepped in front of her. "You can't leave." She looked at him as if he were a poorly trained bellboy. "Constable Macbeth, I have a train to catch." "Nobody goes till I say so," Hamish said, louder than he meant to. The murmur in the hall rose like steam. Lugs moved between them, hackles slightly up, uncertain but loyal. Blair shouted from across the hall, "Let her pass. We're clearing people out. You've no authority to hold her." "She's not cleared," Hamish said. Alison blinked once, slowly. "Are we prisoners now?" Her voice was soft enough to sound polite but carried the weight of accusation. Is that how Loch Dhu treats its guests? The word, Loch Dhu, hung in the air like an accusation against the whole village. Whispers broke out instantly. Hamish has lost it, someone muttered, holding decent folk hostage. Another whispered, he's trying to make up for bungling the case. Hamish felt heat crawl up his neck. It was the same heat that came when someone mocked him at a ceilidh or hinted he wasn't clever enough for promotion. Shame and stubbornness together. Alison lifted her suitcase handle. I am leaving, Constable. No, Hamish said, planting a hand flat on the suitcase. Ye no. Blair stormed over, face purple with fury. Step aside, Macbeth, or I'll have you suspended. Daviot wants closure, and you'll no embarrass me in front of half the hotel. Hamish didn't move. Until Blair formally cleared each guest, no one connected to the scene was meant to leave. Blair grabbed the suitcase handle and yanked. Hamish held it. Alison stepped back gracefully, making herself the picture of fragile innocence caught between two brutes. The suitcase tipped as she stepped back. The clasp popped. A small black notebook slid halfway out onto the floorboards. Hamish's eyes caught the name inside at once, Colin Fraser, and he scooped it up before anyone else could reach it. The villagers watched, fascinated. The tourists edged away as though expecting a full brawl. Luggs pressed himself between Hamish's boots, trembling faintly. Let her pass, Blair bellowed. Hamish said only, She's not cleared. Blair swung toward the guests. You see? He changes suspects every 5 minutes. First the handyman, then the insurance man, now this woman. He's making us all look like fools. I'm not changing suspects, Hamish said quietly. I'm correcting my mistake. Blair sneered. Oh, that's reassuring. You admit you've been wrong from the start. Hamish didn't answer. The truth of it sat heavily enough. Priscilla stepped forward. Hamish, she said in a low, clipped tone, this is not the time. Hamish didn't look at her. If I let her go, it'll end wrong. Blair spat on the floorboards. I've heard enough. Anderson, get this woman on the bus. Macbeth, stand down. Anderson approached nervously. Unlike Blair, he had the sense to look uncertain. Maybe we should wait. Blair rounded on him. Do as you're told. But before Anderson could take the suitcase, Luggs gave a sudden, sharp bark that startled everyone. Not a clue-driven bark. Luggs never offered those. Just fear. Unease. The sound echoed in the stone hall. Alison flinched. Not much, but enough. Hamish seized the moment. Blair, I'll not stand down. The prints outside didn't match any escape. The push came sideways. Someone set a candle by that window. Alison knew which window was drafty before anyone else mentioned it. Blair jabbed a finger at him. That's gossip from maids trying to keep their jobs. You've got nothing. I've got enough to stop her leaving. Blair turned to the crowd. This is what happens when you let a village constable act like a detective. Daviot will skin us alive. Then tell him, Hamish said. Tell him you let the murderer go. A thick silence spread through the hall like cold water leaking across a stone floor. Alison lifted her chin. I will not stay in this building a moment longer unless someone presents actual evidence. She glanced at the watching tourists, recalling her audience. The Highlands are charming, I'm sure, but I did not sign up for amateur theatrics. Hamish felt something inside him harden. All the embarrassment, all the scorn, all the ways he'd been talked down to by people like her, polished, calm, always certain they were cleverer than the village constable, settled into a single cold certainty. He stepped forward, just enough that she had to tilt her head to meet his eyes. You're not leaving Loch Dhu, he said. No till I've dealt with you proper. A ripple went through the villagers, shock, interest, a bit of grim satisfaction. They'd wanted him to take charge for days. Now that he had, they weren't sure what to make of it. Blair threw up his hands. This is madness. Hamish didn't care. For the first time since Colin fell, things made sense. Terrible sense, maybe, but sense. He let go of the suitcase, but only so he could set his own hand on the kirk door, blocking it completely. Blair, he said quietly, if she steps outside before I'm ready, I'll put in writing how ye ignored every fact that didn't suit ye. Daviot can decide what to do with that. Blair's mouth opened and shut. He wasn't used to Hamish threatening him, certainly not effectively. Outside, the plough's engine roared. The road was opening. If she reached it, she would vanish into a world too wide for a Highland constable to chase. Hamish looked at Alison. Her calmness had cracked. Only a hairline fracture, but he saw it. "Go sit down," he said. "We're not done." She didn't move at first. Then she gave a small, measured nod, the nod of someone buying time, and walked back into the hall. People parted for her without being asked. Blair swore under his breath. "Daviot will nail us both to the wall." "Aye," Hamish said, "but I'll not nail the wrong person first." Priscilla, arms folded, regarded him with a cool expression he couldn't read. Approval? Disappointment? Something in between? It didn't matter. Not now. Lugs brushed against Hamish's leg again, trembling slightly but staying close. Hamish turned toward the door, listening to the plough grind nearer. He had little authority left, no official support, and half the village ready to blame him for everything that had gone wrong. But he had one thing that mattered: time. Barely any, but enough to lay the trap he needed before the road opened fully and his suspect slipped into the white world beyond Lochdu's boundaries. The hall pulsed with low voices. Outside, engines idled. Inside, minds were closing as tightly as the frostbitten windows. Hamish Macbeth set his jaw. If he failed now, he'd fail completely. The window was rattling again, though no wind touched it. That was wrong, and Hamish felt it the moment he stepped into the ballroom. People were gathered in uneasy clumps, whispering as if the castle itself might overhear them. Blair stood at the front, arms folded like a bulldog guarding scraps, already irritable that Hamish had insisted on this reenactment. Lugs pressed to Hamish's leg, not liking the raised voices. "All right," Blair growled. "Macbeth wants a wee show for Daviot's precious report. Let's get it over with." Hamish ignored him. He walked to the tall, stubborn sash window and tapped the sill with one long finger. "This is where Colin fell," he said, blunt as a hammer. "And this is the window folk keep saying they tried to open." A murmur rolled through the crowd. Guests shifted uneasily. Villagers leaned forward with the hungry curiosity of people who had been waiting for someone to finally take control. Hamish pointed first to the retired colonel. "You said you tried the catch. Show me." The colonel puffed up, marched forward, and tugged uselessly at the wrong side. The window didn't budge. He muttered something about shoddy workmanship and retreated. "Next," Hamish said. One of the maids came forward, cheeks blotchy, and pulled tentatively at the sash. Nothing. A tourist lady fluttered her hands at it, failed, and apologized loudly. Another guest yanked the wrong edge entirely. One by one they embarrassed themselves, proving exactly what Hamish already knew. The catch only shifted if one understood its trick. A sideways pull most people wouldn't guess. Each failure drew a tightening of Blair's jaw. "This is pointless," he muttered. "Get to the bit where ye claim another innocent person is guilty." Hamish ignored him again. "Miss Drake," he said quietly, "your turn." Alison closed her notebook, raised her chin, and stepped forward with the composure of someone giving a lecture. Lugs let out a thin growl, almost a tremor. Alison didn't hesitate. She reached straight for the catch, pulled it exactly sideways, then braced her hand near the skirting, the same point where the fibres had been found, pushing, as if testing the draft. A silence fell, heavy and certain. Hamish kept his voice low. "Funny, Miss Drake, how ye ken the knack of that window better than the handyman." Blair blinked, taken off guard. The villagers exchanged looks. Alison withdrew her hand with infuriating grace. "I pay attention," she said lightly. "It's my job." Hamish stepped closer. "Aye, you paid attention all right. Candle wax on the sill. Scuff marks lining up with the service door corridor. Prints outside too fresh to be the killer's. Colin wouldn't come this way unless someone lured him. Someone who knew he had a notebook full of trouble for them." The room shivered with sudden understanding. Blair tried to recover. She could have learnt the window from anyone. "You're building castles in the air, Macbeth." "Then explain this," Hamish said, pulling a small folded item from his pocket. "Found in her luggage while Anderson was dithering by the kirk door." Alison's poise cracked. Not broken, but strained. The item was Colin's missing notebook, its corners bent from hurried stuffing. She spoke before Blair could. "He was going to ruin me," she said, with the calm of a woman explaining a disappointment at dinner. "A mistake from years ago. Nothing criminal. But he would have destroyed my career. You don't understand what that means." "No," Hamish said. I didn't understand murder as a first choice. A gasp travelled round the ballroom like a cold draught. Blair puffed up at last, sensing a victory he hadn't earned. Aha! As I suspected all along. Nobody believes that, Priscilla cut in, her voice sharp enough to freeze the air. You suspected whoever was easiest. Blair flushed a dangerous purple. Hamish didn't take his eyes off Alison. You tested the draft with a candle. You knew the catch. You brought Colin by the back corridor where no guests would see. And you shoved him sideways as he leaned out. It wasn't an accident. It was a clean, hard push. Alison looked down at the notebook in his hand as though it were a verdict. I couldn't let him destroy me, she said. Not shouting, not crying, just stating it, flat and empty. No one rushed to defend her. Even the tourists had gone pale. Only Lugs moved, creeping forward to lean against Hamish's leg. Blair barked orders suddenly, thrilled to reclaim authority. Right, Anderson, get her belongings. She's coming with us to Strathbane. Move. Alison straightened her coat, nodded once, and allowed herself to be taken. She did not apologize. She did not deny it. She simply walked out as if she were leaving a disappointing review in her wake. When the police convoy finally roared away through the newly cleared road, dragging tracks in the thawing snow, the villagers drifted off quickly. Tourists muttered thanks or complaints or both. The castle staff sagged with exhaustion rather than relief. Priscilla gave Hamish a long, unreadable look. Not approval, not kindness, just acknowledgement. One more thing he did not know what to do with. Hamish returned to the quiet, shabby station as if walking back into an old coat. Lugs trotted in first, shaking damp snow onto the floor. The peat fire was low, almost out, but still alive enough to coax into flame later. He sat down heavily. No triumph, no satisfaction. Only the dull ache of stubborn work and a storm that had trapped a killer long enough for the truth to show itself. Lugs curled beside him with a sigh. Hamish rubbed the dog's head absently. Outside, the thaw dripped steadily from the eaves. Inside, the case was done, and he felt no warmer for it.